So we've come to the last 2 weeks of studying the book of Genesis, and if you were to ask your average churchgoer today, who is the main character of the book of Genesis, you probably get a lot of different reactions. Some would probably say, well, Adam. After all, he's the first human we're introduced to. His story is very famous of the Garden of Eden. It's one of the most well-known stories in all of the Bible. Why wouldn't it be Adam? Others would say, no, it's not Adam, it's Noah. I mean, the flood, everything there. We tell that to the children when they're beginning. They may be a little foggy on the whole tree of knowledge and good and evil, but they know what the ark is. The main character is Noah, right? You can go through all the book of Genesis and ask yourself this question: who is the main character? And when we get to the end of a book, it's good to start looking back and ask yourself these kinds of questions. So I'm going to answer it for you this morning. Who is the main character of Genesis? God. It's God. It's God the Father. It's the first person of the Godhead. In fact, every other person we are introduced to in Genesis, we are introduced to to reveal to us something about God the Father. For example, we are told about Adam because we read of how God the Father created the world. So Adam's included. We are told about Noah because we read about how God the Father judged the world. Right? We read about Abraham because we read about God's plan to restore the world. We read about Isaac because we read about how God always keeps his promises. We're told all about Jacob because we read of how God must be at the center of your life. And we're told all about Joseph because we read how God is prominent in all of the dramatic events in life. The book of Genesis clearly declares this. If you want to find out who the main character of Genesis is, go to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. God the Father, the first person of the Godhead, is the main character of Genesis. Now, of the other characters, there's a lot of very well-known characters. Certainly, we're not going to negate any one of them. However, there is one human character in Genesis that actually his life spans over 50% of the chapters in Genesis. Only one. Adam, reality, once you get to Genesis about 3 and 4, he's kind of faded out. Noah gets a few chapters in there. Abraham, he gets about 10. The person, his name is Jacob. It was later changed to Israel. So today, when you hear me, I'll sometimes say Jacob, Israel, same guy. We're introduced to Jacob in chapter 25, and his burial takes place in chapter 50, which is the last chapter of the book. So of all the stories and chapters that talk about Jacob, there's a lot to be talked about in Jacob's life, in Israel's life. Yet the book of Hebrews shines one light on his life in Hebrews chapter 11. I'll read it, verse 21. This is in what many consider the hall of faith, if you will, where it commends the believers of old for one thing in their life. Of all the events recorded in Jacob or Israel's life, Hebrews 11:21 says this: by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. I mean, that's a good thing, but is that really the highlight of his life? If you were to read through the book of Genesis and specifically focus from Genesis 25 to Genesis 50 and to think about Israel, what are the main events? I mean, why does the writer of Hebrews say that the greatest act of his life was when he was dying, he blessed his family? Surely, don't you remember when Israel wrestled with God and prevailed? Ooh, wouldn't it be great if it read, by faith Israel wrestled with God and prevailed. Whoa, certainly be more dramatic. By faith Jacob was renamed Israel by God himself. By faith, Jacob occupied the promised land. It's not what it says, though. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. What's special about that? That's what we come to in Genesis 47 through 50. The testimony of Jacob's life. the biggest act of faith he could do. It's an example of mature faith. What's so special about this act to warrant it about Jacob's greatest act of faith? Because it's an example of mature faith. Mature faith. In fact, the book of Hebrews actually talks about mature faith many other times. In Hebrews chapter 5, it actually uses the example of a believer at first, when they first accept Christ. When somebody first starts following Christ, they are what's called a newborn babe, and they're grown on what's called spiritual milk. That's simple things. But as a Christian grows, you get into heavier stuff, and you get more and more serious, and you study the Bible more intensely, and you allow the Bible to transform you in ways that you never thought you'd be transformed. In that same chapter in Hebrews 5, that talks about strong meat. So, the Christian life can be compared to a lifetime of growth and a lifetime of maturity. And what makes this act so special about Israel is because he's old at this point. Now, if you're offended by that, listen, he's 147 years old. I think I can use it for that. He's 147 years old. All right? 147. He is mature in the faith. Sadly, many people live their whole lives and never mature in the faith. And yet there are people that are only believers for a short time and are very mature in the faith. There's no one-all formula for this. The greatest act of his life was his act of a mature faith. So, we could say this: God desires every believer to grow into a mature faith. That means he desires you to grow into a mature faith. Which is the question, great, what does that look like? What does a mature faith look like? I mean, I have faith. What makes faith mature? I'm glad you asked. In this passage, in the last chapters of Genesis, we see two identifiers of a mature faith from the life of Israel. It focuses again on Jacob, or Israel, and it reveals two requirements of mature faith. Genesis 47, look at verse 27. We'll begin there. This is immediately after they went to that back parade. Joseph already saved them as far as he provided for them in Egypt. He left the promised land. Israel left the promised land and went to Egypt and survived the famine. Verse 27 of chapter 47, 27. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Jacob must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Now if I found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. And do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." And he said, "Swear to me that you'll do that." So the first scene we have here is it's 17 years after Israel brought his whole family to Egypt. The famine's probably over by now, right? 17 years later, they still have not went back and entered the promised land. And what happens here is Jacob is on his deathbed, and he requests to be buried back in the family grave in Canaan. Now let's continue reading now. Look what happens next. Verse 48, chapter 48. After this, Joseph, that's his son, was told, "Behold, your father is ill." In other words, it wasn't just he had a cold. No, he was terminally ill. He was about to pass any day. "Your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, Manasseh is the older one. Very important to understand for all of today. Which one's older? Manasseh. That's why he gets first billing there. Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, so Joseph brought his dad, Israel, his two sons, and said, "Your son Joseph has come." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in his bed. So yeah, he's about to pass away any time. His strength is failing him. Israel summoned his strength and sat up in his bed and said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I'll make you a company of peoples, and I'll give you this land. And then he says this in verse 5. And now your 2 sons were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh. Notice Israel, the dad, switches them. It's important. We're going to come back to that. Just tuck it in right now. He switches them. Basically, what happens here is he doesn't just switch them. He actually says, your children, your 2 sons, I'm going to elevate to be my sons in the part of the inheritance, which is unheard of in this time. Unheard of. The modern day equivalent would be, hey, all right, say you're very rich, you're about to die, you have 2 kids and 8 grandkids, all right? You pick 2 of your grandkids and give them equal inheritance as your other 2 kids on your will. Except for more so, because it meant more in this time. That's exactly what's going on here. Verse 8 now. Verse 8 of chapter 48. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, Who are these? Then Joseph said to his father, They are my sons, whom God has given me here. He said, Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. In other words, he says, hey, remember those 2 that I said are going to be mine? These are them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. If you have read the book of Genesis, this is already a familiar scene. This is not the first time where an older patriarch, an older person, was blind and could not see at least details, and he had to bless somebody. In fact, those of you that are smiling right now know exactly that when Israel was younger, he tricked his dad off of giving him the blessing, and he was the younger. He dressed up as his brother when his dad couldn't see. He put the fur on his arm, remember that? And he said, who are you? He said, I am Esau. He tricked his dad into giving him the greater blessing when he was younger. So this scene right here should bring back memories. By the way, this is the kind of stuff, you will never catch this stuff if you don't preach or read all the way through the book of the Bible. Listen, if you just open the Bible, my first time reading the Bible, I'm going to read Genesis 48, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it. Read all the way through. So this is building right here. This familiar scene is going on. The eyes were dim. He couldn't see. He had to bless Joseph's 2 sons that he adopted. Verse 10, now the eyes of Israel were dim with age so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near to him, and Israel kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also. Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself to face to the earth. And look what happens. I'll tell you, these next few verses, this is the meat right here. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand. Let's stop there. What's going on? It's obvious in this picture here. Here was the dad who was about to pass away, who had blessings to pass on, and here was the son over here, and they were facing each other. And anytime you read the scriptures, you'll see it talked about the right hand of God. That's the strong hand. Sorry, lefties, that's just the illustration in the scripture, all right? It just is. The right hand always gives the stronger blessing. So what he did is he's saying, okay, Dad, you're facing that way. I'm going to put Manasseh on my left, your right, because he's the oldest. He should be blessed. And I'm going to put the younger one on my right, your left. That's Ephraim. Joseph does this on purpose to make sure the older one gets the blessing. Are you with me? Look what happens. Oh, this is juicy. Verse 14. And Israel stretched out his right hand. And if he were to go forward, it would be on Ephraim, or it would be on Manasseh. But look, and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger. And his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands. Oh, what's going on? For Manasseh was the firstborn. In other words, so he was over here blind. He says, okay, the older one's on my right, the younger one's on my left. I got that. All right. Boom. and starts giving the blessing. Wow. If you read that today, what's significant about it? Well, he just wanted to go out in style. No, it's more than that. He blessed them, and then look at verse 17. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father. This one is the firstborn." In other words, you can't see. You don't know what you're doing. Let me fix it for you. And only what a father says. Listen to this language. This one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. Verse 19. But his father refused and said, "I know, my son. I know." I have thought for hours all week on those words. I know, my son. I know. What loaded words. He talks about them, he says, "He also shall become a people and shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." He says the blessing in verse 20, and then at the end of verse 20, "Thus he put Ephraim, the younger one, before Manasseh." Unbelievable, unbelievable what just happened. The question is, what does it mean? It's not really our culture to give out blessings like that. That's not really how we do our wills today. It's just, there's a lot lost between this text and the modern day. So what does this mean? What does this mean for us today in 2023 in Marion, Ohio? When he gave the blessings crossed like that, Joseph said, hang on, first, that's not our tradition, you're doing it weird, and then he actually saw it, or he set them up like that because it's their tradition. The oldest ones always gets the blessing, and then when he saw he crossed his hands, he tried to fix it because it displeased him. And Israel's language to him, "I know, my son, I know." Wow. What does he know? I know, my son, I know. What do you know? Israel knows that God is not bound by our human traditions. That's what he knows. Israel knows that, catch this, God is not bound by our personal preferences. That's exactly what he knows. God is not bound by our human traditions. Oh, the oldest one goes first. And he's not bound by our personal preferences. It displeased him. No, I want it this way. This is mine. Oh, if there's one person at this point that knows how God works, it's Israel, his whole life. This theme of God usurping the natural structure and habits and tendencies and traditions and preferences of man is not new to the book of Genesis. Once you read right after the story of Adam and Eve, you're introduced to two others that are in that story, Cain and Abel. Cain was the older, who was the godly one? Abel, the younger. And then you can read even more and you find out that all throughout the history in the book of Genesis so far, the older broke through and was blessed instead of the younger. He knew that God is not bound by our personal preferences or human traditions today. Does not matter how special they are to each one of us. God is not bound. See, that's the mark of mature faith. Mature faith recognizes that God is not partial to our opinions. He's not partial to your opinion. God is not partial to my opinion. Joseph saw it as a black and white issue. Well, this is how it should be done. Joseph expected God to function within a specific set of human parameters. In essence, he put God in a box, if you've ever heard lingo like that. He put God in a box. In fact, Joseph had two boxes he put God into. He put God into the box of tradition. This is how it is. I'm setting it up. And then he put God into the box of personal preference. It displeased me. I'm going to fix it. Two different boxes right there. And I know, my son, I know. The younger's going to do it. I know you prefer it that way. I know this is how our culture does it. But I know how God works. And God is not bound by human traditions, nor is he bound by personal preference. The tradition of man is that the oldest gets the greater blessing. This tradition can get us all because we are creatures of habit. This is an impersonal thing. It's almost an unconscious thing. It's just what we do. And when something goes awry or something gets done that's not what we usually do, we have a tendency to say, whoa, hang on a second, we don't do that here. Hang on a second, that's not how it is. Well, hang on a second, and we do that in our homes. We do that in our homes. Oh, we usually eat dinner at 5 o'clock. Why is that? Why? It's 4:30. I'm not hungry yet. Ask me in 30 minutes. I'll be hungry. Right? I mean, we're so creatures of habit. We don't realize that sometimes we can create a box like that. And then the box of personal preference, it displeased him. This was personal and this was intentional. And I've heard people say sometimes, in the scriptures, never anything is said bad about Joseph. Oh, Joseph was corrected in a loving way by a father at this point. I know, my son. I know. But the younger's going to receive the greater blessing. Wow. Joseph missed it here. Jacob nailed it. Because God delights in doing things his way. What does this mean for us? It means that because God delights in doing things his way, you and I should surrender our traditions and preferences and just let God have it his way. Boy, this is so hard to do because we're creatures of habit. But God delights in doing things his way. So what do? Surrender your preferences. If you fail to surrender your preferences and your own point of view, you will end up putting God in a box that you've constructed. Do not put God in a box. He says, I know, my son. I cannot tell you the hours. It's just captivating what he's telling him there. I know. I know how it's supposed to. I know how it's been our whole lives. I know what we were taught. I know all that. But I've seen God do things outside of our regular ways. That's what he's saying. Think about this scene. Not only is it father and son, Joseph and all of the scripture has been portrayed as great. I don't know if you know this. Joseph is second in command of all of Egypt right now. You don't just talk to him like that. Only a dad can do that, though, right? This scene must have been marvelous, this family moment here, but Joseph was probably, no doubt, dressed in his royal apparel. He's mastered another culture in Egypt. He speaks another language. Joseph has been managing the economy of the entire world. He's the second most powerful person in the world. All of this is portrayed positively in Joseph until we get to this text. And here his daddy is saying, Joseph, you have a lot to learn about God. That's exactly what he's saying. God actually delights in upsetting our natural order and habits. Do you know why he does? God delights in upsetting our natural order and habits because whatever gets done then, he gets the glory for it, not us. He actually delights in upsetting our natural order. The pattern of the younger serving the older and the younger having set precedence over the older is completely foreign to the culture. It's just in their tradition, that's not how it's supposed to be. Yet, Abel was greater than Cain. Isaac was chosen over Ishmael, and Jacob received the blessing over Esau. I know, my son, I know. Israel is telling Joseph, I know this is how we do it, but God does not care about our traditions or preferences. He will work the way he wants. When Jacob corrects Joseph, his son, it's the only text where Joseph's perspective on God is wrong. And to be honest, in this passage, not only is his perspective on God is wrong, he has a complete double standard. He's not just a little, Joseph is not a little bit off, Joseph is way off. He has a double standard because, remember, his two sons were adopted as sons of his dad. That's not supposed to happen. But how did he feel about that? Oh, he loved it. Hey, you can upset the natural order when it benefits my family, but if the natural order is upset and I don't like it, ooh, that's a big no-no. Double standard Joseph right here. Double standard. Joseph's okay with being the 11th son and yet receiving the double portion himself through his two sons. But he insists it's his firstborn that gets it, the first blessing. You can upset the order if I get my way, if I'm beneficiary, but if I don't come out on top, we're going to do things we've always done. That's Joseph. He liked that his sons were elevated to be sons of his father, which breaks tradition. But he had a problem with the breaking of tradition if it wasn't what he wanted. Boy, do we need to be careful. We need to be careful. God is not bound to do things your way. He's not bound to do things my way. We need to surrender our preferences. To be honest, we have no right to determine how God should work. We don't have that right. We don't have that liberty. God is God. And if there's one main character in the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God. And it's full of God upsetting the natural order of man and doing whatever he wants. You ever wonder, why did God even create anything? Why didn't he create an 8-day week? You ever wonder those little silly questions? He could have. He could have structured the solar system to have 8 days. Why? The answer to it is because he wanted to. Just because he wanted to. He's God. He can do what he wants. He's the sovereign ruler. Why did he judge the earth, find it fit to judge the earth, to send the flood to Noah? Because he wanted to. Why did he upset the natural order and allow Isaac to get the blessing and not Ishmael? Because he wanted to. God is sovereign. This is the major theme in Genesis. And this is the lesson that Israel is trying to tell Joseph and show him by crossing his arms there. Boy, if God would do things our way, we would take all the credit. We would. But he actually delights in not doing things our way because he gets all the glory for it. You see, there is no room for territorialism or pride when it comes to God's work because it's God's work. We can't put God in a box. We can't put him in the box of human tradition like Joseph did. We can't put God in the box of personal preference like Joseph did. I want Manasseh to have the greater blessing. You don't understand how God is not always, he's not bound to our preferences or traditions. He was saying, Joseph was saying, God, I want you to work within this set of parameters, within my preference and within my tradition. This is the way it should be. Israel was telling him, my son, God does not care about our traditions. In the New Testament, it's talk, you hear the language a lot. God is not a respecter of persons. What does that mean? It means he'll do what he wants. All those are bound up in that loaded phrase, I know, my son, I know. You see, mature faith recognizes that God is not partial to our opinions. Mature faith recognizes God is not partial to our traditions. Church I worked at one time was in Lancaster, California. It was classified as a mega church, over 2,000 people in attendance regularly. And one of my responsibilities at that church for a while was on the bus routes on Saturday. They had buses, the fleet of buses they sent out on Saturday. They had a fleet of buses they sent out on Sunday. And I was the one kind of had to organize the whole Saturday bus routes. I think we had 5 buses that came in, over 200 kids every Saturday. I would have a meeting with all the teachers, just rally everybody together, try to figure out some pain points from the week before, how it can be structured better, give them some tips here and there and everything. And one of the things about being out in California working there, one of my most important responsibilities was I had to take a video camera and actually video all of the kids. I had to get their faces. If they covered up their face, I had to say, no, you're not allowed off the bus until I see your face. I had to video all the kids getting off of the bus and on the bus with a live timestamp on the screen. Why? For some reason, in California, there are always a few people that can figure out a way that when they see a big church, they have dollar signs in their eyes. And they try to figure out a way that, hey, if you kept my kid too long or I didn't have permission or anything like that, we're going to sue you and get rich quick. And believe it or not, people think like that. There's a few out there. So we had to do some things like that to actually prove, no, we had your kid this much, this time he got off the bus, this is the time he got on the bus, right? To legally protect ourselves while we ministered to these kids. One time on Sunday, or on that Saturday, the buses were coming in, and all the buses came from the next town over called Palmdale, and there was one road that connected the two cities called Sierra Highway. One day, the buses weren't there, and they should have been there, and then I got a text message saying there was an accident on Sierra Highway, and they can look back in the traffic. Sure enough, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all 5 buses. I'm thinking, okay, we have to get everybody here. I called the teachers back into the gym where the meeting was. All right, they're going to be late, but it's no big deal. There's an accident. They'll probably get here. Prepare a shortened lesson, something like that, right? Maybe skip snack time, or do a quick version of the game, or skip the game, or something like that. And then we had no choice but to just wait. We waited. And then we waited longer. And the time started passing even. Okay, just don't do any snacks. Don't do any games for this week. This is just going to be. It's just going to be a fun week, a different week, and I'm trying to put a positive spin on it for the teachers and everything, right? Come to find out, there was 15 minutes before they had to leave, and I see the buses roll in. We didn't have time to get everybody to their classrooms with 200 kids and then get them back on the buses. So we see the buses coming in from down the street. It's not how we planned that day to go. Buses are coming in. I have all the teachers here. I'm 10 different classes. I'm like, okay, so what are we going to do? Somebody said, why don't we just skip all the classes, because the time for transportation, to get them all there, they'd have to leave right away. Why don't we just have a big rally in the gym, and somebody can just share a little gospel message? I said, I love it. Great. I loved it. I'm thinking, I have 10 teachers here that all have prepared lessons. I didn't realize they were all looking at me. I'm like, okay, once I kind of realized what they meant was, you take care of it all. I didn't have anything prepared. Buses were pulling in the parking lot. What was I supposed to do? That's not what I signed up for when I signed up for that ministry. There were 200 kids coming in. I didn't even have time to prepare. I had to go get the video camera to record them. There was part of me and my spirit that was not happy, to be honest. I was not happy of God upsetting the natural order that day. I wasn't. There's a term when it comes to preaching, it's a big term, but it's called extemporaneous. What it means is you preach without any notes and without studying of any kind. You open the Bible, you say a verse, and then you just start preaching. I'm not an extemporaneous preacher. It's not me. It's not my preferred way. That's not what I do. But God didn't care what I thought that day. He didn't care about my preferences that day. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have time to open my Bible at all. The only thing I could do is I had 200 kids in front of me. I opened it to John 3:16. I had about 8 minutes. I opened it to John 3:16, and the best I could, read the text and explained the gospel and asked if people wanted to be saved. And I've preached several times before that, but that was the first time that I got to lead people to the Lord after I preached in my life. 2 kids wanted to be saved after that. It's not what I wanted. But God didn't care. It's what he wanted. God has every right to upset our natural order and to plan our calendar for us because he gets the glory for what gets done. He has every right to do it. God is not partial to my ideas, to anybody's ideas here. He's not partial to our habits. He's not partial to our preferences. God is partial to doing things his way. And this is what Israel was trying to teach Joseph. I know, my son. I know. We cannot reduce God to our preferences, traditions, or habits. We cannot reduce God. Mature faith recognizes that God is not partial to our opinions. So, believe it or not, that's only the first requirement of mature faith. Is that acknowledging that God does things his way. Because of that, there's times in our life when we need to recognize, God, this isn't the way I planned it. This isn't what I thought. This isn't what I signed up for. This is, but you're God, I'm not. And Lord, I'd rather do things your way. That kind of surrendered heart is what you see in the book of Acts in the New Testament. That's what you see in the New Testament when the churches went all over. Do you think Paul planned to get stoned? You think he planned to get run out of town? Oh, but God has a way of glorifying himself through upsetting our natural order. So surrender our preferences. Second requirement is this. Israel teaches him, his son, the lesson of God is not partial to us with crossing his hands. But what he did before that was he told Joseph and he told his sons, hey, and all through chapter 49, we won't spend time to read it, but you can read it. He goes through all of his sons and he says, this is the blessing you're going to have from the Lord. He doesn't just bless Ephraim and Manasseh. He blesses all of his children, and he blesses Joseph. And you know what he says to Joseph? He says, Joseph, there's a mountain there there's a mountain there. I'm thinking of it right now. Here's where it's next to, and back in the promised land, I'm going to give you this mountain. Question, problem here. He doesn't occupy the mountain right now. He's down in Egypt. What's he doing? Israel is making promises and writing checks that's not in the account, trusting God to make the deposit. It's exactly what's happening. He's saying, I know I'm still down here in Egypt, but after I'm gone, I'm gone, take me up, bury me in the promised land, and while you're in there, I want you to check out this mountain. Later, you're going to occupy it, and your son, I want you to occupy this land, and I want you to occupy this land. He doesn't even own the land yet. Yet he still believed the promises of God, even though those promises did not come true in his life. He was writing checks, trusting God to make the deposit. What does that mean for us? It doesn't matter if he spent the last 17 years of his life not occupying the promised land, but down in Egypt. Much of those 17 years he spent surviving a famine. God, you left that out of my plan when he told me you were going to bless my whole family. Right? What does this mean for us? We need to trust God whether we succeed or whether we suffer. We need to trust God. The second mark of a mature faith is realizing God's not bound to do things our ways, number one. Number two, we need to trust God no matter if we succeed or suffer. Here, he could have spent the rest of his day in the promised land, but he was forced to migrate to Egypt and leave the promised land. Yet he says, God's not finished yet. I'm going to die, but God still has promises that he's going to fulfill. For 17 years, Jacob was probably thinking, this isn't what I had in mind when I decided to follow God. Yet at his death, he was still blessing his children with land he doesn't even own yet. Why? Because God promised. He believed God that much. That is mature faith. when you act on the promises of God even before they are even fulfilled. That's mature faith. That's the strong meat that Hebrews 5 is talking about. And this actually builds on the last one, because when you don't put God in a box, when you realize that God doesn't have to work our way, you realize there's no situation in life where you can't trust God. You can trust God in every situation in life. Whether you succeed or whether you're facing sorrow. Whether things work out your way or whether you don't. Whether you get healed or whether you don't get healed. Whether you get rich or if you get poor. God's still good. And there's no situation in life in that you cannot trust him. Hebrews 11, once again, says it this way. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Wow. What's so special about that? His faith became a mature faith. You may not receive all the promises of God in this life. You may never have that dream job or physical healing or financial blessing, but are you willing to follow God anyway? Are you willing to follow God if he empties your bank account? Are you willing to follow God if you lose your house? That's mature faith. Mature faith. It's not being tossed around by the ups and downs in life. Jacob is dying blind, yet he sees the promises of God. Israel died old and weak, yet strong and mature in faith. Now, a mature faith does not start off as a mature faith. A mature faith starts with simple faith in Jesus. So maybe you're in this room and you need to grasp that mature faith and you need to take one of those 2 action steps that God's working in your heart. But maybe you're here today and quite frankly, you don't even know what I'm talking about. It's okay. It's okay. Just know this, a mature faith starts with a simple faith in Jesus. 1 Peter 2 says this, like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation. Once again, using that illustration of the life of growth. John 3, Jesus talks to a man named Nicodemus and tells him all about you have to be born again. You have to start your journey of faith. You're never going to get to a mature faith if you never accept Christ as your Savior, if you don't start with a simple faith in Jesus. Maybe you're not to the mature faith yet, but maybe you just need to have a simple faith in Jesus, or you want to know more. If you died today, you don't know where you'd go. You don't know Jesus as your Savior, or you have questions about it. I'll be up here in a minute, and I'll be up here after the service. Please come talk to me. I'd love to open the Bible and show you how you can know for sure that you have that simple faith and you can start the journey of being mature in the faith. So if you want mature faith in God, you must surrender your own preferences and trust God in the ups and downs of life. By doing that, and it's only when that happens, is God truly God and glorified for what he does. Let's pray.